Have you ever wondered why Alaska is so dang big and why it's even a US state? Well, in this video I'm going to explain that and much more fascinating history. Alaska is, of course, the largest US state, but just how large is it? Texas, the second largest US state, fits within Alaska 2.5 times. However, a map like this doesn't even show the true size of Alaska because the island chain the Aleutians, in part shown here, extend for over 2,500 miles. The Aleutian island chain actually makes Alaska nearly as wide as the entire lower 48. The Aleutians are home to the westernmost point in the United States, Amitignac Island, only 30 miles away from the Eastern Hemisphere, as well as the furthest east point, Semisopocno Island, only 8 miles into the Eastern Hemisphere, which means that the east, west, and northernmost points in the United States are all in Alaska. The Aleutian Islands are named after the native Aleut people, who were the first to come into contact with Europeans and gave us the name of the state Alaska, which was their name for the mainland. The first time Europeans came into contact with Alaskan natives was when the Russian Empire met the Aleut in the mid-1700s. And the Russian Empire quickly realized that there was a lot of money to be made in Alaska. Specifically, fur from seals, otters, and other Arctic wildlife. However, the Russians had a very difficult time actually catching any otters and seals. Whereas the Aleut, who had been living in Alaska for millennia, were excellent at it and had navigated and explored much of the Arctic before the Russians had ever gotten there. And so Alaska was made a colony, Russian America, and the Aleut people were enslaved and forced to actually hunt for all of the fur that the Russians wanted. After only 50 years of Russian colonialism, the otter population of Alaska declined from 300,000 to near extinction. Today there are only 50,000 left in the wild, despite a century of conservation. The Russians also introduced a number of diseases the Aleut had no natural immunity to, and so their population decreased by 80% by 1800, and today is still less than what it was before Russians arrived. Despite being Russian for over a century, no more than 1,000 Russians actually ever lived in Alaska. After a disastrous defeat at the hands of the British, French, and Ottoman empires in the Crimean War of the 1850s, the Russians were in desperate need of money to pay their debts. And because Alaska was no longer profitable, the Russians decided to sell it. Even though British Canada was right next to it, the Russians weren't interested in selling to their arch-enemy, and the British were probably more inclined to actually take it by force. They instead sold it to the recently reunified United States for the equivalent of $140 million today. Roughly 300 times cheaper than buying Twitter. The Russians never explored inland and only settled in the Aleutian Islands and the Alaskan Panhandle. When the Americans did explore the interior of Alaska, they found gold and a lot of it. So much gold, in fact, that they had to redefine the border of the Alaskan Panhandle with British Canada. The border wasn't agreed until 1903, when the British largely accepted what the Americans said was the border. The Canadians did not think that the terms were agreeable and refused to sign, although the British did on their behalf, which rightfully outraged the Canadians, which was a large contributor in the Canadian push for independence from Great Britain. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about what an emirate is and why some of them united. So follow if you'd like to see that. Thanks for watching.